Good afternoon and welcome to today's NAJA Roundtable, Authentic Authorship, Understanding Indigenous Claims and Connections. This webinar is part of a Covering Indian Country series hosted by the Native American Journalists Association that examines the unique challenges confronting journalists who cover Indigenous communities. Today's roundtable is intended to help non-Indigenous editors and producers understand the nuance and complexity of Indigenous connections to better understand Indigenous claims by sources and authors. Our panel will discuss aspects of identity, including citizenship, enrollment, descendancy, kinship, blood quantum, DNA testing, and federal and state recognition. This webinar is being recorded, and the recorded video will be available on the NAJA website and YouTube channel. This roundtable series would not be possible without the generous support of our sponsors: the Ford Foundation, the Knight Foundation, Democracy Fund, Google News Initiative, the Walton Family Foundation, Tegna Foundation, and the Gannett Foundation. We thank all of them for their continued support. Our panel moderator is Gabe Galanda, the managing lawyer at Galanda Broadman, an Indigenous rights law firm headquartered in Seattle. Gabe may take questions from the audience as time allows. Please use the Q&A option at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit a question. Gabe, the panel is yours.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everybody. My name is Gabe Galanda. I belong to the Round Valley Indian tribes in Northern California, Mendocino County, Covelo to be specific, descending from the Nomaki and Concow peoples. And as Brian said, I make my home here in Seattle, Washington. I just want to begin by thanking NAJA for extending its wide platform for conversation about these very critical issues as they face everyone in Indigenous society and face the journalism community as well. We're here today to try to explain and examine some of the common misnomers and misconceptions about Indigenous identity, or indigeneity for short, and what it means for fair and exacting media and news coverage of modern Indigenous life. And I want to begin by having each of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves to the NAJA community and to today's audience. I'm going to start with Twyla.
I'm Twyla Barnes. I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. I'm a genealogist and a blogger, and I specialize in Cherokee genealogy and debunking myths of false Cherokee genealogy.
Thank you. Deb? Unmute.
Myself.
There you go.
Shocked most. I'm Deborah Kroll, enrolled member of the Haklo or Halon Salinan tribe from the Central California coast. And I'm one of two Indigenous Affairs reporters at the Arizona Republic. And thanks for having me.
Great. Kim?
I'm Kim Talber. I am Assistant Wapton Oyate enrolled, and I'm also, my grandfather was from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, so that's where the name Talber comes from. And I am an associate professor at the University of Alberta and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment. And I'm here in part because I wrote a book called Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science. Nice to be here.
It's great to have you all. I want to frame the discussion, at least from my point of view or my discipline, which is law, and observe that pre-contact, there were thousands of Indigenous societies that existed in what we know today as North America. And by and large, and I am loath to be general about this because every Indigenous society is unique, but by and large, those societies identified or self-identified through their own words and language as the people or as kin. Generally speaking, each people or peoples were connected through reciprocal relationship with each other as human beings, with the land and its plants and animals, with the cosmos, in which the most powerful force was the creator or some similar deity. But that reciprocal relationship, which was sacred, is known today as kinship. And I want to cite the Dakota anthropologist Ella Deloria, who said this about Dakota kinship. And again, we risk generalizing by citing to any specific tribe, but I think her words here at least give us some helpful context from Dakota point of view. By kinship, all Dakota people were held together in a great relationship that was theoretically all-inclusive and coextensive with the Dakota domain. And that was practically all the government there was. It was what man lived by. But by the 17th century, colonial settlers began to treat the people as government or nation or citizenry. And there were certainly peoples who did resemble what we would call government, like the Haudenosaunee and its confederacy. But settlers did that in order to justify, principally through treaty making, the displacement of indigenous kinship societies and the dispossession of the lands to which our peoples were related and remain related. In 1832, US Supreme Court Justice John Marshall confessed, quote, the words, quote, treaty and quote, nation are words of our own language, meaning settler language, selected in our diplomatic and legislative proceedings by ourselves, having each a definite and well understood meaning. We have applied them to the Indians. By that time, meaning the early 19th century, meaning within the first half century of the United States' existence, indigenous group and individual identity had begun to transmute, in great part as a matter of federal law and policy. By 1790, the United States began to identify and list indigenous persons on quote unquote Indian payrolls, thereby beginning the commercialization of indigeneity. By 1817, the US began to ascribe a fictional blood quantum to indigenous persons under a since debunked inheritance theory, thereby racializing indigeneity. And 2 centuries later, indigeneity is confused, if not schizophrenic, particularly its parlance and portrayal. And I'd ask the non-Indigenous community to think very carefully about the words that you're hearing today, so that when you next put pen to paper, you consider the exact parlance that we're using today. Indigeneity today cannot be measured by citizenship card issued by a federally recognized Indigenous nation. It cannot be measured by skin color. It most certainly, as Dr. Talber will discuss, cannot be measured by a DNA test. That requires media outlets and journalists to do very difficult investigative work regarding authors and subjects who are or purport to be Indigenous. And we have very recently seen how outlets like Crosscut here in Seattle and the New York Times have faltered in that regard. Meanwhile, legitimate Indigenous perspectives, once absent from mainstream media coverage, are now appearing more frequently and across more media platforms. While the coverage often remains biased and incomplete, mainstream outlets are increasingly seeking content and perspectives from Indigenous peoples. Among some non-Indigenous editors, producers, and publishers, there is a growing recognition that the authentic words and stories of Indigenous people, society, and nations must be told. And now we'll begin our Q&A with our panelists. And I want to start with Kim, and she's given me permission to call her Kim rather than Dr. Talber. Kim, what are the critical distinctions that journalists should know regarding terms like quote unquote Indian or Indigenous or Native American or American Indian or Indigenous peoples or a nation's specific name? And what are the challenges associated with those words?
I forgot this question was coming first. I always tell audiences when I give talks that they will hear me use all of these terms, and it will seem to the unlearned listener that I am just using them randomly, but that's not the case. If I use the term Indian, I'm using it for a particular reason. If I use Native American, First Nation, Indigenous, it's always for a very particular reason. So these terms change over time and they change over space. So what is a politically correct term is going to differ depending on where you are, when you are, and who you are. So those of us from Indian country, those of us from tribes, will throw the word Indian around a lot, especially older people like me. I'm in my 50s. Young people kind of cringe more at that term, but you'll hear our elders use that term a lot. Why? It's the term they grew up with. And it doesn't mean that we don't know that it's a colonial imposition, but it's an insider term that we, in a sense, know how to use in a nuanced way. I would say in the United States, the most politically correct pan-Native term right now is Native American. I moved to Canada 5.5 years ago. That term now hurts my ears because of the American part. But I recognize when I come back to the US that I slip back into that terminology. In Canada, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are legal terms. These are not just pan-native terms. They have very specific legal purposes. And I personally don't like when we pick up the term First Nation in the US. It's watering down the legal specificity, I think, that it has for some people. More recently, Indigenous is kind of probably since the early to mid 90s. That's the first time I heard the term Indigenous when I lived in Boston. And I thought it was some weird urban East Coast thing that didn't apply to people that were tribally connected. I've since traveled globally. I've worked all over the US and Canada. I'm a lot more comfortable with the term Indigenous. And it is a term that I think is used a bit more in community in Canada than it is in the United States, because it's now a bureaucratized federal term in Canada as they move from Aboriginal to Indigenous. People-specific terms, ask people what they want to be called. I think that's always the first rule, right? It's okay to ask, what do you prefer to be called? What term is appropriate in this situation? And understand that there's not always and everywhere an exact correct term. Is that
Wonderful.
sufficient, Gabe?
Yeah, it's great. Deb, let's start talking about citizenship and membership. What should journalists appreciate about the distinction between enrolled tribal citizenship or membership, and how do those concepts interrelate with indigeneity more generally?
Well, the difference is that if you are enrolled in your tribe, enrolled in your native nation, if you are a citizen of a sovereign tribal nation, that means that you have all the same rights and responsibilities as any other citizen of any other nation. If you are not enrolled, there are several other terms that can be used. I know some tribes refer to people as acknowledged descendants. Other tribes refer to people as community members. These are people who are acknowledged to be Indigenous, to be connected to the community, but for whatever reason don't meet the specific criteria to be enrolled as a tribal member or tribal citizen.
So are you saying that someone can be Indigenous although not enrolled as a tribal citizen or member?
Absolutely, yes. Now, moving away from those terminologies, there are also people who were once citizens or enrolled members, but for whatever reason became disenrolled. And 95 times out of 100, or maybe even 99 times out of 100, those are political disenrollments. It doesn't mean that they do not have tribal blood, or that they are not Indigenous, or they aren't members of that particular tribal heritage. It just means that for whatever reason, the current tribal leadership has decided they don't need to have this pesky person in their tribe anymore. And then moving away from that, you have people who for whatever reason either choose not to be enrolled. And I do know some people, like in Southern California, where there are several of the Tongva tribal communities. She chooses not to be enrolled because she works with all of them. They all know that she's a Tongva, but she doesn't want to show favoritism to any of those tribes. Then you have people whose grandmother or grandfather or great grandfather was a tribal member, but for whatever reason, those connections were broken. Those people generally might have a drop of blood, but I would not consider them Indigenous unless they were making some sort of a concerted effort to become reconciled with their tribe. And if their tribe and their community was amenable to allowing them to reconnect with them. So now we're getting into the one of the big problem children of Indian country, and that's the wannabes or pretend Indians, those people who might have some, way back in the day connection, or even a story, a family story that's been passed on saying 4 or 5 generations ago, we left the tribe. And we never return. And this person just thinks it's really romantic to be an Indian, or thinking, well, all I have to do is check this box and I'll get these benefits reserved for, Native Americans, tribal members, Native people, Indians, or however you want to call it. So in my point of view, and I think a lot of other people's point of view, is that it's perfectly okay to say, I had a great grandmother who was a member of X tribe, but I cannot consider myself a member of X tribe, but I consider myself an ally because 4 generations ago, my family member was part of that tribe. What is not okay if that person says 4 generations ago, my family left that tribe never to return, but I'm still a tribal member. I know in my heart I'm an Indian. That's where we start to get into trouble.
Twyla, let's talk about the Cherokee Nation, your nation. There was a recent national news headline, I think published in the New York Times, among others outlets, that the Navajo Nation overtook the Cherokee Nation as the largest tribal government by citizenship population. Cherokee, for lack of a better description, has some of the most liberal tribal citizenship criteria in the United States. How does Cherokee determine who belongs as a citizen, and how is that metric of belonging different, generally speaking, than other nations?
It's different in the sense that many other Indian nations use a blood quantum minimum in order to enroll. The Cherokee Nation does not have a minimum blood quantum. We use direct lineal descent from the Dawes roll. And we have Cherokees that may or may not even have what we call Indian blood. We have Cherokees who descend from freedmen. They were listed on the freedmen section of Dawes. They were not recorded with the blood quantum, even if they had an Indian ancestor. So we just use the direct lineal descent. And freedman, the term freedman is used for Cherokees who were formerly enslaved by Indian Cherokees before the Civil War. And then there was a treaty in 1866. We adopted them as citizens of our tribe. And so when we enrolled for Dawes, they were put on their own section with no blood quantum. And it's important for us, for Cherokees, to just everybody see that we're just citizens of a nation. We are not a race. We are not based on, do you have a 4th Cherokee blood? It's about citizens of a nation. And that's how we see it. We are all races. We are mixed race. So that's a big difference between the Cherokee Nation and other Indian tribes. We see ourselves as a nation, not a race.
And you discussed the Cherokee freedmen, and of course the 4 other tribes of the so-called 5 tribes also had a history of slavery and emancipated slaves based on treaties from the mid-1860s. But what should journalists know about the freedmen citizenship controversy or discourse, especially in the moment we find ourselves in 2021 in terms of racial reckoning?
At the time of Dawes, when that base roll that we use was created, it was just a list of citizens of the nation. And then, fast forward to 2007, the Cherokee Nation took a vote to add a constitutional amendment requiring Indian blood in order to enroll in the Cherokee Nation. That primarily targeted the people that descended from the freedmen roll, because they didn't have a blood quantum recorded, no matter who their ancestors were. It didn't matter if they had Indian ancestors, they didn't get a blood quantum. So they were going to be removed under that constitutional amendment. And they were disenfranchised, and they fought. And there was a court battle between the freedmen descendants and the Cherokee Nation. And it went on for about 10 years. And then in 2017, a US court ruled in favor of the freedmen descendants, and the Cherokee Nation decided they wouldn't fight it, they would accept it. And so then 4 years later, we have finally removed by blood from our Constitution, and that will not figure in on who is or isn't enrolled, who is or isn't included anymore. Now we are truly a nation of people, and we've removed the things that could potentially harm or disenfranchise people in the future.
Great. Kim, you've heard, and you certainly know full well these words: citizenship, kinship. You've heard Twyla discuss distinction between political classification and race.
Yeah.
Can you help further those distinctions and discuss how those notions interplay with broader notions of Indigenous belonging?
Sure. And thanks, Twyla. That's really an interesting and concise history of the freedmen issue, because I think it's so misunderstood out in the broader public, all the nuance of that history. So I appreciate that. So citizenship, kinship, and race are the three terms that come up a lot, and you've already heard them from both Deb and Twyla. So citizenship, as Twyla was indicating, tribes control those regulations by and large. We have tribal enrollment ordinances, it's often called. So you'll hear either enrollment or citizenship. People who are very pro tribal sovereignty and representing us as nations will say, don't use the word enrollment, use citizenship, but in everyday use, we use both. You can go to many tribes' websites and find their enrollment ordinances and the rules by which you could apply for enrollment or citizenship. So tribal governments have websites with regulations on them, just like state and federal governments. That said, the political economic power of the colonizer really shapes the world in which we attempt to pass laws and regulations. And we are at a severe power disadvantage as tribal nations or First Nations against federal authority. And so one of the things that I write and talk about is the way that several hundred years of colonialism, despite the way that we struggle within the colonial edifice to set our own rules and regulations, continues to influence the world in which we are able to operate. So is tribal enrollment on the one hand or citizenship colonial? Yes, in part. We live in a colonial soup. We're not Superman or, Batwoman. We can't live outside of the colonial edifice, but we struggle mightily within that. So that's kind of how our citizenship works. And you can think about nation state citizenship too. It's very compromised. It's very political. There's a lot of people that get disenfranchised, right? And we struggle within our nation states to try to do citizenship in a way that's more inclusive. Some of us like to exclude. So the other term is kinship. And we do attempt to manipulate blood quantum rules, lineal descendancy rules. Maybe those will come up in order to adhere to our, I won't use the word traditional, but our kind of cultural ways of thinking about kin. And I would say there are some long-standing ways of doing kinship that have survived, but as we have had to survive in a colonial world, we've probably certainly re-articulated newer forms of kinship. But we attempt to manipulate those citizenship rules, I think, to include kin. Sometimes we manipulate them because we exclude people we don't consider kin. So that's the tension between kinship and nation. Then there's the term race. You will often, as you move through Indian country, hear tribal leaders say, as Twyla just said, we are a nation, not a race. You hear that a lot. It is true that we are multiracial peoples. In my own family, we have people who code as red, white, and black, right? We're a multiracial family. We have multiracial tribes. It is true that when you have tribes with blood quantum limits, that tends to correlate with race, right? So we can get into the conversations about how race affects citizenship and et cetera, but it's good to keep in mind that race is not the same as tribe and it's not the same as indigeneity. Did I get at the whole question, Gabe?
You did, but could you explore the tension between political classification and race? We see sometimes when CNN posts a chart and there's other, and we're not mentioned as compared to say African American, Asian American, or Latinx Americans. We say, wait, we're not even in the conversation. But then again, we say we're also not a race. How do we reconcile those positions or those states of thought?
Well, I mean, in a sense, you can't really get out of being racialized, right? I mean, it is to not be counted. And of course, we fill out a US Census. I think one of the problems with the US Census is that it's a self-identified thing. You check a box. That's not the same as tribal citizenship. It's not even the same as kinship to go beyond citizenship, like Deb was talking about. So I actually think the numbers on the US Census, I think they say 2.5% Native Americans in the US. I think that's inflated. That includes people like Elizabeth Warren. It does not include tribal citizens and our kin. I think that's a much smaller number, maybe 1.5 to 2% of the country. But yeah, it is. It's difficult to talk about that. To on the one hand say we need to be counted, and on the other hand say we're not a race. I don't know how else. Maybe Deb or Twyla can answer that question better than me. It's a contradiction that we live with. I'd like to see the numbers be enrolled tribal citizens, but then I'd also like to see our citizenship be not have these disenrollments because of per caps and political things too, and freedmen being disenfranchised, right? So,
Deb, if you want to address that, and then while you're at it, you alluded to these other statuses earlier, acknowledged descendant or community affiliation, but maybe playing off this race versus political classification and then explaining some of those other more nuanced distinctions. What do you say?
Well, I think Dr. Talber really kind of homed right in on that because, you know, Native nations have to live within the system that they find themselves, that the US government has basically told them, you have to have criteria. You're not just going to let anybody join your tribe or join your tribal nation. I want to make sure that we're sticking to the tribal government end of things and not get too much into the cultural side yet. So you're going to have, you know, the tribe says, okay, we have to set something up. And by the way, there are a growing number of tribal governments that are moving to descendancy simply to avoid being bred out of existence. Just a really brief, you know, my 30-second take is that Indigenous peoples have always been geneticists. You know, we've always understood the genetic health. We've always understood why inbreeding is not conducive to maintaining a healthy gene pool and healthy, you know, we would call it strengthening the blood by marrying out. That's a really big contributor to why Indigenous peoples here in the Americas are so, I guess you could say, racially diverse, because our elders always taught us, don't marry your cousin, you know, go marry somebody from a far away community to make sure that your blood is strengthened. So, but that too has become politicized. You hear about people who have mixed, you know, tribal members who've mixed with African Americans, tribal members who've mixed with Asians, tribal members who've mixed with Hispanic people, tribal members who've mixed with white people. But this was all in the beginning meant to create a wider genetic gene pool. And when you get into the blood quantum end of things, that's where things really get sticky, because of that fact that we obeyed our elders' directives to not marry too closely in the community, to marry outside of the community. In Navajo Nation's case, not to marry someone who's too closely related to you through the clan relationships. So that's where you start to see more and more tribes moving towards a descendancy from a predetermined role. In my case, it's the 1928 California Indian Census. Other tribes will, you know, like the 5 civilized tribes, Twyla, are they all on the Dawes rolls, their various Dawes rolls? Yeah. So you'll see more of that happening. And so kind of refresh me on the rest of what we're bouncing off of here. So that's the difference between blood quantum and descendancy. And then of course you get into, particularly in California, where the upheaval from 3 different waves of European incursions have left a lot of tribal communities still kind of writhing around in chaos even 100 years later. And that's where you get into my friend who doesn't want to be enrolled in any of the Tongva communities because she prefers to keep herself away from those tribal jealousies because she's working on behalf of all the Tongva peoples. You've got other people who are 100% connected to that tribe. One family actually went to the trouble of exhuming their ancestors' remains to get a DNA test to prove that yes, we are a member of that culture, and setting aside the queasiness from digging up a dead ancestor to prove that yes, you are related to that tribe. That again goes back to how the colonial system has done its very best to disrupt tribal communities. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, so you spoke about what I'll call claimed descendancy or claimed kinship, and I want to throw this out to Kim. I saw a recent news story that had someone claiming contemporary kinship ties, which certainly caught my eye in a strange way. But can you discuss some of the challenges that we see manifesting in terms of descendancy and kinship?
You mean when people are invoking lineal descent and what they're trying to do with that broadly outside of tribal government as well?
Correct. I mean, what are some of the sort of benefits and drawbacks of that or challenges associated with that?
Oh, of moving to lineal descent. If that's what you mean. I mean, I think it's interesting.
In the broader space of authenticity, when you see people using descendancy or kinship, perhaps in ways that are not authentic, I'll be honest.
Yeah. I had some notes for the previous answer on blood quantum, so let me start there. Certainly, Deb's right. And there's a scholar, Kirsty Gover, who wrote an article in 2008, a legal scholar, about the move throughout the 20th century from total Indian blood in tribal enrollment set by the feds. This is when the feds were in far more control. To moving towards lineal descent throughout the 20th century. And a lot of this happens post-World War II, as you have massive numbers of Native people moving off reservations to urban areas, both to enlist in the military and also because of federal relocation programs, assimilation programs. So this is when tribes really start moving toward tribal blood quantum away from total Indian blood. So they move from this notion of race to this notion of tribe. And it might sound the same, federal Indian blood versus tribal blood. It's not the same. It's really moving from a racial category to a genealogical tribal category. And then you see, as Deb said, tribes moving towards lineal descent. That's the way we're moving now, precisely because we cannot enroll our grandchildren. 3 of my mom's 6 grandchildren can't get enrolled. Everybody knows who the Talbers are, right, on our res, but that's because of blood quantum. So it is something we're really grappling with within tribal governments and tribal communities. That is true. But you're also seeing this maybe parallel move out in the public as we move more from blood thinking to genetic thinking. And this happened, I'd say tribes are behind on this in a good way. We have not moved totally from blood to genes in terms of the way that we think about family. And one would be mistaken to think that's gene talk is more scientific than blood talk. It's not. When you're talking about blood and genes out in popular culture, we're all speaking symbolically, whether we're Native or not. So, but tribes have really stuck with blood a bit more because it's worked into our regulations, as you've heard, right? Whereas in the popular kind of imagination, the DNA testing craze begins around 2000. We sold more DNA genetic ancestry tests like Elizabeth Warren took in 2018, I think, than you did from 2002 to 2017. Suddenly you had as many in that year. So it's really this craze, right? That is also this kind of parallel move to think about, it's kind of a one-drop rule that is characterizing these genetic ancestry tests. I have one ancestor somewhere, maybe, let me go take a test and try to find them. That's kind of what the public is doing. That's a little bit different, I think, than the way we're doing it within tribal citizenship, because we go back to a named ancestor on a roll. It's a person that's tribally affiliated. They're a named person. So when I turn over the back of my tribal enrollment card, it's got 1/4 this, 1/32 this, 1/16 this. There's no scientific assessment of blood going on in those fractions. Those are ancestors. 1/32 something is my great grandfather. 1/4 order this is my grandfather. There, you could actually put a name next to those blood quantum fractions. I don't know why the settler government like to make us use fractions, because really we're attempting to attach names to that. So it might sound like it's the same, but it can actually be quite different. But I think I'm getting away from the original question. I do think this language of lineal descent that we deploy in really specific ways within tribal communities is also getting used out in the public in a really different way, that is allowing people to take a DNA test and make a claim to a Native identity based on some percentage on a chart that they get from a DNA testing company. But one must remember, the ancestors that they're tracing back to in those tests have no names, they have no tribal affiliation. It's very hard to tell, and they could be quite long ago. There's no living community for you to connect with. That's a very different thing than applying for enrollment or citizenship in a tribe and attempting to say, I have these relatives within the last 2 to 3 generations, and this community knows my family, and I just want to kind of solidify and formalize that relationship. That's a really different thing, if that helps.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
Twyla, let's talk about this concept of fake tribes. The LA Times did a pretty bold piece on fake Cherokee tribes, but give me your take as a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, and speak to the harm that causes legitimate nations, be they federally recognized or state recognized, not just economically, but culturally, politically, and otherwise.
I don't know how much other legitimate tribes deal with fake tribes impersonating them, but Cherokee tribes, for us, it's a huge issue. We have 3 legitimate Cherokee tribes: the Cherokee Nation, the United Kituah Band, and the Eastern Band. Those are the only 3 legitimate Cherokee tribes. There are over 200 fake tribes that claim to be Cherokee tribes. And the reason that they're so harmful, it's not just the financial. The LA Times did that amazing series where they uncovered over $800 million worth of contracts intended for minorities were going to fake tribe members, which that's a huge issue. But it's more than that. They pass out cards that people then take and they give them to their employers, pass themselves off as legitimate. They can confuse law enforcement with it, saying, you can't take my child, it's an Indian child. Or schools have even gotten in trouble for accepting fake tribe cards and then applying for federal money intended for Indian students. And that happened in Arkansas with the Lost Cherokee group that aren't legitimate. So we have those problems going on. And then we have these people who claim to be something they're not, and they go to schools, they give presentations, they say, this is our tradition, this is our culture, this is our language, and they aren't telling the truth. I mean, they make it up as they go. They misuse the Cherokee language. It's a real problem. And a lot of times the average American citizen doesn't have enough knowledge to know the difference. They believe it. And sometimes it's easier for a fraud to present themselves and be believable because they dress like the stereotypical spaghetti Western Indian, where the authentic Cherokees I know walk around in clothes just like everybody else wears, except for special times, but it's very easy to fool the American public. And we've seen some articles where journalists have quoted fake Cherokees and our mouth, hit the floor, and we're like, but they didn't know. It's not their fault. They didn't know, but it can be a problem.
Kim, we have a question from the audience, and you sort of alluded to it, but the question is, who exactly sets the parameters for enrollment?
Well, I feel like we've been talking about that a bit. I mean, I am of the mind, but I'm not an attorney working, in federal acknowledgement or anything. I'm of the mind that we have a great deal of leeway in tribal enrollment regulations these days. But I do know, having read a bit about the anthropology and history of the Office of Federal Acknowledgement and kind of histories of the Indian Reorganization Act, certainly the feds had a heavy hand, especially in the last century, over deciding who counted as an Indian and who did not. And I think it might differ from tribe to tribe. I think newly federally recognized tribes, I think, is my understanding, is of a bit more oversight because they've just come through that process of sort of convincing the feds that they're real Indians. But in my tribe and the few tribes I'm affiliated with and the one I'm enrolled with, we have a great deal of say in the way that we do our tribal regulations now. So I don't know if, Deb or Twyla have or you do, Gabe, other insights into that.
No, I think that's helpful. In short, the tribes decide, and there has been great federal influence of the metrics upon which they decide who belongs, as Kim has explained. Deb, you've mentioned disenrollment, and I'll ask you about enrollment moratorium, which is the other side of that coin in my mind. But can you explain disenrollment and in short, why, as Kim says, our grandchildren are not even being enrolled these days, and how that contributes to this discussion about journalism?
Well, disenrollment is basically the tribal council votes to exclude Jane Smith and all of her relations. They generally use purport to say they no longer meet the criteria. They will disavow somebody's grandparent as actually being a tribal member. But in reality, when you really look and you dig deep and you investigate, you'll find that, and of course there's always an exception, but 99 times out of 100, it relates to politics. The tribal leadership does not want somebody who disagrees with their decisions. They want to reduce the number of tribal citizens who are eligible to participate in it. The world knows it is per capita payments. The actual term would be profit sharing from the various tribal enterprises, usually a casino. And then you've got, on the other side of the coin, you have, in the case of some tribes, they have done a moratorium. There will be no more new enrollments, whether or not that person meets the criteria to be enrolled in that tribal nation. We see that. I can't speak for other states. I'm most familiar with California, and of course I live in Arizona, so I'm familiar with Arizona. But in California, where I'm most familiar with, a lot of times that too is related to casino revenues or other tribal revenues, because they don't want to dilute the payments that they get. That leaves people who have legitimate tribal ties and a legitimate criteria, who meet the legitimate criteria, either without a actual tribe, or in the case of some people I know, are just continue to with the connections of the non-federally recognized tribal community that they were associated with. But the other side of the coin with tribal enrollment moratoria is that it creates a situation where grandchildren don't get enrolled, which contributes to fewer and fewer tribal members splitting a bigger pie, which in the long run can potentially contribute to the end of that tribal nation, because they have sliced and diced themselves out of existence. And that is a serious problem that we as journalists need to follow. I mean, I can't have a personal opinion, except that even my own tribe has enacted a moratorium, because they are in the final process of turning in their petition to the BIA for federal acknowledgement, and they don't want to enroll anybody else until that process has been worked through. Going to federal acknowledgement, we have 1 or 2 tribes that have been working this for 50, 60 years. And the very real possibility is that nobody in my generation is going to be alive by the time the BIA finally gets around to adjudicating whether or not we're a tribe. That to me is a serious problem in itself. For the state recognized tribes, I understand with Twyla's and the Cherokee people's dilemma that sometimes a tribal group will convince a state to give them official recognition. That doesn't negate the fact that there are a lot of indigenous peoples who are legitimately state recognized. In California, that process happened, I think, about 15 years ago with the enactment of what we call the CEQA ordinance, which was a de facto recognition of all indigenous peoples of California for the purposes of cultural repatriation, cultural areas, cultural monitoring, which is better than nothing. There are other legitimate tribes that are state recognized, and it's a full state recognition through the legislature just says, we say XYZ tribe is actually an official tribe with ties in the state. In California, it was like all the indigenous peoples are acknowledged as having claims to cultural, how do I explain this? To claims to the cultural artifacts, claims to the various lands within their ancestral land areas. So since there's 2 major Salinan groups and a couple of splinter groups, that means we all get to dicker over if they find burials in a construction site. Everybody gets to dicker over, well, who's going to take charge of these burials and who's going to be in charge of reburying them. Sometimes it works and sometimes it devolves into whatever.
So taking a question from the audience, are members of a state recognized tribe not considered indigenous until they achieve recognition? And I'll just answer that by reference to Deb's comments. The answer is they are indigenous, even though they might not have federal recognition, or they might not have a citizenship card to a federally recognized tribe. And the example she gives in terms of repatriation is an example where indigeneity can be broader than just federal recognition or tribal membership. We're getting some good questions that I want to make sure we have time for, but quickly, Kim, you've alluded to this earlier, but tell us, what are the problems with direct-to-consumer DNA and genetic testings in terms of journalism's trying to figure out who's really indigenous?
Well, there's 2 types of tests that, broadly speaking, that you need to understand. There's the genetic ancestry test, and that's what it's called, that 23andMe sells online, that Family Tree DNA sold online. I think Ancestry.com has got its own company now. These are those tests that are looking to see if you have ancestry among the founding populations of the Americas. Again, they're not tracing you to a named person that you can affiliate with a particular indigenous community, because the genetic markers that they look at among those founding populations are shared in higher and lower frequencies throughout the Americas. So thousands of different indigenous peoples throughout the Americas. So a DNA test like that, it might say, well, it's in higher proportion in this region or that region, but there's also probably hundreds of different tribes and peoples in those regions. So they cannot be used to affiliate you with a living indigenous community. They're interesting, that's all they are. For those who understand tribal citizenship, you will know now that those do not apply. And the DNA tests that tribes and First Nations will sometimes use, or often use, are the common parentage test. And the reason that they will use it is they might need to document close biological ancestry, say usually to a genetic father is what's more often in question. So they can invoke that biological father's tribal genealogical documents, and they can't use those to enroll a child until they know for sure that that's the genetic father, if they care about that. Some tribes will say, we'll do a DNA test, or we will take an affidavit from 3 family members saying we claim that child. I think that's a much better way to do it, actually, because to me, that's enacting a more traditional form of kinship. But so keep it in mind, when you hear that tribes use DNA tests, it's true, but it's not these ones that they're selling online that are not pointing to a specific tribal person. in your genealogy. Does that help, Gabe?
It's perfect. There's been a question posed about the list, which we'll get to in a minute, but a related question from my friend Pamela Palmatier up in First Nations. Hi, Pam. It's great to see you. I'll direct this one to Kim as well, her colleague in First Nations country. She observes the problem with ethnic frauds in academia, which I believe is pervasive in Canada and the United States. But Kim, can you speak to that? And what do you think is a remedy to deal with frauds in the academic environment in particular?
Oh, can you hear my sirens outside? I just gave a talk yesterday to the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity on playing Indian and histories of that and what that looks like, whether it's hobbyists or Boy Scouts or Boston Tea Party and now and New Agers, and now it's people claiming Native ancestry and, playing Indian. Universities are a hard one. I mean, and Pam will know this, I think being at Ryerson or ex-university, we're calling it now. Universities are controlled by non-Indigenous people. They're largely controlled by white people. They do not want to touch this, and especially when you're living in this world in which, and I talked about this yesterday in this talk, we are in an era of multiculturalism and diversity. And in this era of multiculturalism and diversity, anybody can choose to perform any identity they want. That's to be inclusive. We talk about, we're in this era where you can choose your ethnic identity. That is not the way that Indigenous peoples, capital P, tend to think about this. We are born into our community. And if you're scooped or you're forcibly out adopted, you can reconnect, but there has to be there's a living community of vibrant people that we care about. This isn't about connecting to some dead ancestor at some point. But the kinds of claims that we make about what legitimately counts as an Indigenous person or a tribal person or a member of a First Nation, those are definitions that are not necessarily widely understood or widely shared by the non-Indigenous public. And that's who's in control of universities. So they are very into box checking, into self-identification. They don't want to be called exclusionary. They don't want to be called identity police. So they're not thinking about how to reform our rules about how one gets to identify as Indigenous within a university. And on the prairie universities of Canada, some of our Indigenous administrators are working hard to try to figure out how to do this in a way that is not just allowing every box checker like Elizabeth Warren, who takes a 23andMe test, to say, hey, I'm Native, but while also being able to include people who may not meet federal Indian status, who may not qualify for band or tribal membership. And that's a really hard thing to do. So, I can't really get into the details of the kinds of regulations we're trying to put in place, but we are thinking hard about it. Was there another part to that question though?
No, that's great.
Yeah.
But let's segue to this issue of the list, which we knew would be a question, is in fact a question from our audience. Native Twitter in particular has been ablaze about the creation of a list claiming to out non-Indigenous people profiting on indigeneity. And I really want to focus on ethics in terms of each of your disciplines: genealogy, journalism, and academia. And I'll start with Twyla, but is your work guided by an ethical code, and how might that ethical code sort of govern this conversation about the list?
Genealogy definitely has an ethical code that we follow. First, if someone specifically hires you to do their genealogy, you are not at liberty to share that with anyone else without their permission. There have been articles about a particular Cherokee genealogist who says they were hired by Andrew Smith, and they've shared the genealogy publicly, probably without her permission. That doesn't mean I support Andrew Smith. I'm just explaining the ethics behind that. That's not ethical. So we should not share those things. We also should be very careful with living people, sharing the names of living people. Just because you're trying to expose someone. I did the Elizabeth Warren research. I focused on Elizabeth Warren and those people who had passed away. I didn't point out her brothers. I didn't point out nephews, nieces. That's unethical. We went her backwards. And if one of her parents would have still been alive, I wouldn't have shared their name. unless, she's a different situation because she's so public. But the point is, you have to protect the living, and you don't share information that someone hired you. If you were hired to do a job, you don't publicly share that.
Okay.
And
Deb?
can I say something else
Yeah,
really
go ahead,
quick
Twyla.
about state tribes? I know that other tribes, non-Cherokee tribes, may have legitimate state recognized tribes. For the Cherokee specifically, only for the Cherokee, we have 3 legitimate tribes. There are state groups recognized. They are not legitimate Cherokee tribes. And I just want to emphasize, only for Cherokee, any state recognized tribe that claims to be Cherokee is not legitimate. So there are only 3, and I want to make that clear, 3 legitimate Cherokee tribes.
Deb, your take on my question, and feel free to respond to Twyla as well.
Oh, hey, no problem. As a journalist, having those sort of things out there are, to me, it indicates that there's definitely an issue with people who are claiming connection to a Native community who really should not be. That said, as a journalist, if I were to suspect that somebody that I'm interviewing or trying to use as a source for a story isn't really who they claim to be, then it's my responsibility to go research that. It's not my responsibility to go look on some website purporting to out whoever. We have plenty of ways to verify that, starting with calling the tribal nation the person purports to belong to, or is this person enrolled? The tribe will tell you if Mary Smith is an enrolled member of that tribe, or they'll tell you Mary Smith is not enrolled, but we do claim her as a community member. And so I feel pretty confident using that, since the tribal government itself has confirmed that. If that's not confirmed, then we need to take steps to figure out why that person isn't enrolled. Is it a case of being disenrolled? Is it a case of her grandmother was taken away to an Indian school and lost connections with the tribe, but the person has a genealogy and they can point to something positive, saying at one point they had an ancestor who was connected with the tribe? Would I put down that person is a member of that tribe? I might say the person's grandmother was taken away to an Indian school and lost connections with the tribe. And then, of course, we have the people who you can't find anything for, and that's when you have to dig a little bit deeper. And if I can't figure it out, I have a whole department of investigative reporters who are pretty good at figuring things out. And it could very well be that a prominent person claims Native heritage who really should not be. That in itself is a story. There are other people who claim Native heritage who may not be enrolled, but we can verify that they have at least some connection with their community. Or a person that says, my grandmother was taken away to an Indian school and lost connection with the tribal community. And yes, I have tribal blood, but I don't consider myself a member of that community. I might be an ally. That's perfectly okay to put in too. The problem is, of course, when they lie. If they lie and we catch them at it, it's my responsibility as a reporter to out them.
Right. Kim?
I have so much to say. Before I get to my own stuff, I think we do have a question, though. It's not just individuals who are making legitimate or illegitimate claims. We have to know if a group is legitimate as well as if an individual is. And in a sense, you have to understand if the group is legitimate before you can even ask about the individual. So I think it's easier to find the individuals, but the reporter, the journalist, is going to have to make a call. And journalists not working in Indian country are going to have no clue about who the fake groups are. I feel for them. How are they going to begin to find that out, especially within the parameters of trying to do a story over a couple of days or even a few weeks? So I think the people that are going to do this best are people that commit to working in Indian country and on these stories. If you're going to just drop in once, you're probably not going to do it well. I personally wouldn't recommend that. You're going to get in trouble. You're probably going to cite people you shouldn't be citing. With regard to the list, another list was published this week. Investigation, it's anonymous, but it's a very thorough, I can't remember how many page reports, quite long, maybe 52 pages. Investigation into false claims to Indigenous identity at X University. Not doesn't say X, but this is in Canada. They've got 6 bios, pictures, CVs, genealogical documents. It was done anonymously. It looks pretty thorough. This is a problem. So as an anthropologist, I look at all of this as these are cultural artifacts of this moment in time. This is such a problem. We are in a pretendian pandemic. This is such a problem. This whack-a-mole kind of approach to it. I'm gonna, out one here in 1980, and they come back 20 years later. That's not going to work. So I totally get why people are out here doing these reports anonymously and making lists. This problem is not going away. It's not going to go away by these individual approaches to this. Daryl LaRue wrote a book called Distorted Descent that documents tens of thousands, you probably can't see it, but tens of thousands of these fake Métis people. Cersei Sturm wrote a book called Becoming Indian, over 200, as Twyla said, fake Cherokee groups. This is an epidemic in the US and Canada. If you've got hundreds of thousands of people, if not millions of people doing this, I don't know what people do. So as an anthropologist, I'm watching these lists really closely. I think this is fascinating. And it's telling me they've had it. Native people have had it with the appropriation of resources. It started with the land. Now it's an appropriation of our identities in order to, as Daryl talks about in Canada, they are organizing, making these fake cards. They are suing for resource rights. They have histories of opposing Indigenous resource claims in Canada. So now they're suing for logging rights, fishing rights. They're making fake cards. They're getting tax breaks. The LA Times story showed hundreds of white people who became Cherokee small business owners, getting millions of dollars of contracts. There are actual resources at stake. And there is not going to be a comfortable, ethically pure way to approach this problem. And so I'm really going to keep my eye on all of these anonymous lists that are coming up. And as an anthropologist, that's what I do. I'm studying what the settler colonial world is doing and how they continue to appropriate from us. So for me, the list is any of these lists. There are many, including in these 2 books, there are lists. This list that everybody's all upset about over Twitter, this is only one among many, many lists that have been constructed for many years. That's my response.
And just one really good rule of thumb. And again, Dr. Talber really says it right, is you really have to make that commitment to spend the time to learn about Indian country if you're going to report on these types of issues in any sort of a coherent manner that doesn't get you into trouble by quoting a fake person or a fake group. But one good rule of thumb is if there's a Cherokee group in California that claims to be a Cherokee tribe, it's run. It's about 100% certain that they are not a legitimate Cherokee group. So the moral of the story is that one way to at least start to parse if a group is legitimate is, are they within their ancestral territory? So for the Cherokee people currently, that would be Oklahoma or North Carolina. For where I come from, it would be Monterey or San Luis Obispo County. So if there's some Salinan group trying to set up in San Diego, the chances are they're not real. But then from then on, of course, there are other ways you need to start parsing. Are they a group that charges for membership? Will they just, welcome anybody, whether they're native or non-native? Are they more of a club than an actual historic community that you can look at newspaper accounts from 100 years ago or 150 years ago, and they talk about, the Indians who live in the town of Halone, which is one of our principal ancestral villages. I have newspaper clippings from a 1921 paper in King City, where they talk about making the long trip to Holone to go see the Indians. You know, those types of things. It sounds like kind of quirky, but that's one way to another step that you can use to identify if a tribal group is really who they say they are. You know, there's other things, but you know, you've really got to do your homework. You've got to look at a variety of things. You know, the anthropology, the archaeology, the history. Is there a consistent historic record of, I hate to say it, but you know, when Europeans showed up, they found people living in, and I'm going to use my tribe again, living around in this area, which later became Mission San Antonio, Mission San Miguel. There are historic villages there, and that's where they recruited / abducted Indians from to build their missions. So there is consistent historic record of Salinan Indians, which Salinan, of course, is just the anthropological term for us, of Indian people from the towns of Holone, from Limot Non, from Chochenyo, from Cayucas, from Cholam, from various other Salinan villages, that the Europeans said, yes, this is where you go find Indians. And the people who are descended from where the Europeans said, this is where you go find Indians, are, you know, there's a pretty good chance we are really who we say we are. If you have some group somewhere in the Midwest or on the East Coast, and it was like, well, you know, we got chased out of X and now we're here. If there's no historic record of Indians getting chased out of Manhattan Island and chased away to Kansas, like the Delaware tribe, they really were chased out of Manhattan Island and eventually, you know, became the Delaware tribe of Indians. You know, if there's no historic, no artifact, no anthropological, and if they just have a little nonprofit and they just charge you $50, and guess what, you get to become a member of this tribe, that's a pretty good bet they're fake. But, and of course, this is just a 30-second, you know, condensed version of how you can determine if a tribal group is legit or not. There's a lot more nuances than that. But use some of those things as a starting point, and then you can always talk to people like myself, people like Gabe. You know, if Dr. Talber is not totally immersed in teaching the class, Notch is a really good source. You know, they can help you find experts who can help you parse if a particular tribal group is really who they say they are. Because, and again, it is easy to get caught up in the romance and the feathers and the, you know, the pretty outfits, and not get down to the nitty gritty that these people really are who they say they are, and they have a history, and they are indigenous, whether or not, you know, they wear a double eagle feather war bonnet, which they don't have any right to wear, or if they wear Armani or whatever. And I'll get off my soapbox now.
So we're over time, but it seems to me Deb's takeaway to the journalism community is learn the history, learn the anthropology, and by that I don't mean settler history and settler anthropology. If you're lucky, you will learn the oral history of the peoples about whom you're inquiring, which will be easier said than done, I promise you. But we're over time, and I want to give Twyla and Kim one last question. What is the single tip you would each give the journalism world about navigating this landscape? Go ahead, Twyla.
Research, reach out to the tribes that someone might claim that they're from. Reach out to a group that you know, the tribe that you know is legitimate. If you come across someone who says, I'm Cherokee, reach out to the Cherokee Nation, reach out to the Katua, reach out to the Eastern Band, ask them. They're always willing to help. And I'm sure other tribes that aren't Cherokee but are legit are just as willing to help, because this is something, it's a battle we're fighting together. you can reach out to me. There are other Cherokee genealogists that are always willing to help. So just reach out to people if you don't know the answer. If I have even done screenshot tutorials to help journalists do research. If they didn't know how to access a database or get through it or research it, I've made screenshot tutorials with arrows, and I don't have a problem doing that to help people. And there are a lot of others who would help as well. So if you don't know the answer, just reach out to someone who will help you.
Excellent. Kim?
I can't really add to what Twyla said. I think that's right. I did want to make one final point that I forgot to make. I do not think most of the people making these false claims are simply lying or being deceitful. I do not think that. I think they are operating on a fundamentally different idea about what constitutes indigeneity than those of us who come from Indigenous communities, be those urban or reservation. But I mean people who have a lived experience with an Indigenous collective, right? We have a collectivist idea of what it is to be Cherokee, Dakota, whatever, Pomo, whatever you are. It's about the collective. People who are making these false claims quite often have a very individualistic worldview. It's about my ancestry. It's about the story in my family. These are not the same definition of what it is to be Indigenous, and they are privileging these individualistic, ancestry-based property notions of what it is to be Native when we are privileging the community and the collective. And it's not that the community and collective is always politically pure and comfortable, they're not, but it is at the end of the day, it's about privileging a collectivist worldview over an individualistic worldview. And I think that's where the differences come in. And we're asserting our collectivist worldview. We're not just saying you're all just a bunch of liars and unethical people. We're asserting our worldview.
That's an excellent note to end on. I want to thank our panelists. All three of you are spectacular. The conversation exceeded my expectations. I want to thank Brian, Sterling, and Nadja for hosting this conversation. And I want to thank our audience for hanging in there even a bit over time. We hope you learned something about how to cover these issues and you have a newfound respect for indigeneity and all of its complexion. So I wish you all a very great summer, and thank you all very much for being here today.
All right. Thank you, Gabe. And thank you again to our panelists for this very thought-provoking conversation. We appreciate their time and their expertise. I'd also like to thank our audience, and we'll encourage them to subscribe to the NAJA newsletter, visit naja.com, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter for announcements about future roundtables in this series. This concludes today's NAJA Roundtable. We'll see you next time.